My name is Ernest Halbrook, and I am 82 years old. Most days I wake before dawn because sleep has become something fragile and restless, a thread that breaks easily with the faintest sound of the wind outside or the creak of the pipes in the walls. I lie there in the dim light, staring at the cracked plaster ceiling of my old house, feeling the silence press against me. Silence is different when you are old. When you are young, silence is peace, a chance to think, maybe even a comfort. But when you are my age, silence becomes weighty, like a blanket that suffocates. There is no voice calling you from another room, no soft footsteps in the kitchen, no laugh in the hallway. Just the ticking of the clock on the wall and the occasional hum of the refrigerator. I live in a body that does not obey me the way it once did. After the stroke 5 years ago, my right leg became unreliable, my right hand weaker than it used to be. They put me in a wheelchair, and even though the doctors spoke of recovery and therapy, I understood very well that this chair was no temporary prison. It was my new home, my new pair of legs. People like to dress up the truth with optimism, but I have lived long enough to know when optimism is nothing but sugar coating on a bitter pill. I try not to think of myself as broken, but rather as diminished. I can still speak. I can still think clearly. I can still remember things that others would rather forget. Yet the world does not see that. To most, I'm just another old man in a chair, someone they have to wheel around, feed on schedule, remind about his pills. They forget that I had a life before this, that I once marched in uniform across foreign soil during the Korean War, that I once carried the weight of survival on my back when artillery fire lit up the night sky. They forget that I once held my wife's hand as we stood together in the middle of a modest kitchen, planning a future that at the time felt limitless. All of that is invisible now. What they see is the sagging skin, the faltering hands, the chair that squeaks when I move across the hardwood floor. Old age strips you of the respect you once commanded and leaves you with something worse than pity. It leaves you with condescension. I live alone now, although alone is perhaps not the right word since my daughter insists she and her husband take care of me. They moved me back into this house after my wife died, saying it would be safer for me to remain in familiar surroundings. But I have come to realize that their interpretation of care means coming by once a week to check if I am still breathing and to make sure I have not spent money on anything they disapprove of. They are efficient in their visits, like bankers auditing an account. They smile. They ask me if I have taken my medicine. They open my mail as though it naturally belongs to them, and then they leave. Sometimes, if they are in a good mood, they bring me a bag of groceries. If they are not, they bring nothing but sharp comments about how expensive it is to keep an old man alive. They remind me in ways subtle and not so subtle that my very existence is a burden. It is not easy for me to say this, because once I believed that family was a fortress, unshakable, a source of loyalty you could count on even when the rest of the world turned its back. I grew up in a time when blood was supposed to mean something sacred, but the years have taught me a different lesson. Blood is not always thicker than water. Sometimes it turns thin, diluted by greed, ambition, or simply indifference. My daughter, who as a child once clung to my hand so tightly she would not let go even to cross the street, now avoids looking me in the eye when she speaks about practical matters. My son-in-law, who pretends politeness but cannot hide the contempt curling at the corners of his mouth, treats me as though I am already halfway in the grave. They are waiting. That is what I feel every time they are near. Waiting, calculating, preparing for a day when they no longer have to check on me because I will not be here. I try not to dwell on it too much because bitterness corrodes a man faster than age, but it is impossible not to notice. They speak of my finances with the same tone men use when they discuss investments. They say things like, "We need to think ahead, Dad," or It would be so much easier if everything were in our names. I smile when they speak that way, but behind the smile I feel the sting. Easier for whom? Not for me. I already know what they want, but I refuse to give it. This house may be old and the walls may be thin, but it is mine. These savings may not be vast, but they are the fruit of a life of discipline and work, of years spent as a machinist in a factory where the noise was deafening and the sweat ran down my back until my shirt clung to me like glue. I earned every dollar by sacrificing my health, my time, my youth. And now they want it as if it were theirs by right, as if my life were just a prelude to their inheritance. I remind myself daily that dignity is not something others can take away, unless you hand it to them. Even so, the struggle is constant. To roll through one's own kitchen in a chair, to wait for someone else to open a jar, to need help bathing, it eats at you. The younger people speak of independence as if it were air, invisible and guaranteed. Only when it is gone do you realize that independence is the very foundation of being human. Without it, you start to feel invisible, erased. But I refuse to be erased. I speak to myself sometimes to keep my voice strong, to remind myself I am still here. I read aloud from books that belonged to my wife, her underlines still visible in faded pencil, and I imagine her voice answering mine. I roll to the window and watch the street outside, the children riding bicycles, the dogs tugging at their leashes, the delivery trucks honking at each other impatiently. Life goes on out there as if nothing has changed, while in here the air feels heavier, slower, stuck. My wife's absence is the sharpest wound of all. Martha was the center of this house, the warmth in every corner. When she passed away, the rooms went cold, not in temperature, but in spirit. She would have never allowed our daughter to treat me this way. She had a way of holding people accountable, of reminding them of their humanity when they tried to forget it. I often imagine her voice now, soft but firm, telling me to stand my ground, even if standing means rolling forward in this chair. I can almost see her face when I close my eyes, the way she used to smile at me across the table in the mornings when the sun made her hair glow like gold. Sometimes I whisper to her, not because I expect an answer, but because I need to believe she is still with me in some form, somewhere beyond the reach of cruelty and selfishness. And so, my days are marked by ritual. I wake, I struggle into my clothes, I roll into the kitchen, I brew a pot of coffee, I toast bread, and I sit in the same chair where I sat for decades when my children were young. Only now, the voices are gone. No laughter, no arguments, no footsteps running up the stairs. Just me, the coffee, and the ache in my chest that never quite leaves. Some days I feel strong enough to read the newspaper and shake my head at the madness of the world. Other days I fold the paper without reading it, because the only madness that matters is happening inside my own family. I am not blind, nor am I naive. I see the glances my daughter and her husband exchange when they think I am not looking. I hear the sighs of impatience when I take too long to answer a question, or when my hands fumble with a button. They are already rehearsing life without me. But here is what they do not understand. I may be old, I may be in this chair, but I am not finished. I have seen death before. I have looked it in the eye and lived another day. I know what it is to be underestimated, to be dismissed as irrelevant, and I know how to survive it. Age has taught me patience, and patience is a weapon in its own right. For now, I let them think what they will. I let them believe I am powerless, dependent, incapable of resistance. But inside, a quiet fire still burns. The fire of a man who has been betrayed, yes, but who has not yet surrendered. It began on a Sunday dressed up as kindness, the kind of early spring Sunday that used to smell like roast chicken and floor polish and my wife's perfume, but now carried only the thin scent of disinfectant from the wipes my daughter kept in her purse. And when they came in, they did not sit the way family sits, shoulders melting into familiar chairs and voices softening with shared history, but took places like inspectors in a rented office, my daughter at the head of the table with a pastel binder labeled Household Planning, and my son-in-law opposite her with a sleek pen laid neatly parallel to the edge, as if the alignment of his tools might align the world. And before the coffee could drip into the pot, or my breath could settle, they were already spreading papers and a bright fan, talking in cheerful tones about convenience and peace of mind, and how hard it is nowadays to manage anything without a plan. And I knew in the slow tightening of my chest that the plan they had in mind was not a plan for me to live more easily, but a plan for them to hold more firmly the things that were still mine. They had learned the vocabulary of concern the way other people learn a foreign language in night classes, repeating phrases until the accent disappears, durable power of attorney, advance directive, healthcare proxy, revocable living trust. So smooth and efficient, it would have been beautiful if it had not been aimed at my life. And when I said that, I could read just fine and would prefer to take my time, my daughter's smile stretched a little further while her eyes contracted. The way windows do in a storm, and she said, "Of course, Daddy, of course." But it would really help everyone if we could sign the basics today, because the notary was waiting in the car and she had already taken care of the fee. And wasn't that thoughtful? I looked at the color tabs, blue for medical, green for banking, yellow for real estate, and at the polite paragraphs that began with whereas and ended with consent. And I heard behind the legal words the sentence they were too refined to say out loud: "Let us hold the keys now because you will drop them eventually." And when I asked why today, of all days, why the hurry, my son-in-law made a compassionate face. He must have practiced in a mirror and told me that his colleague's father had fallen for an online scam last month and lost everything in an hour, and that there were people out there who preyed on the elderly, and wouldn't it be better if everything important were sheltered under their careful supervision? And I answered that I had weathered war and factory layoffs and mortgage rates that would make a young man faint, and that I did not intend to surrender my name to a signature I hadn't studied. And something in their posture tilted almost imperceptibly. A shared glance skittered across the table like a water spider, and my daughter's fingers began to drum the laminated cover in a rhythm that told me the cheerful route had reached a barricade and the detour would not be scenic. The first sign was small enough to pass for a mistake. The new pill organizer she brought me, shaped like a rainbow and pre-filled for my convenience. Only the Monday morning slot held the wrong dosage of the blood pressure tablet and the Tuesday. Nightspace had 2 sedatives where there should have been half a pill. And when I pointed it out, she laughed the light laugh she uses on waiters who forget a side dish and said, "Oh, Daddy, you must have mixed them up after I left." And because the room was already slipping sideways, I let it pass. But the next day, when the mail vanished before I could reach the door and reappeared, opened and neatly repackaged in the binder's pockets under a section called Correspondence, I asked for my keys back, the set I have carried since the year I returned from Korea, with a head full of noise and a pocket full of promises. And she said not to worry. She had made it simpler by keeping one master set at her house, less to lose, fewer jangling reminders of the past, which would be charming if it were not theft shined up with good intentions. Then the landline, the stubborn old phone on the kitchen wall, died one evening while I was listening to a ball game, a soft click and nothing. And the next morning my son-in-law arrived with a slim gray rectangle, programmed with only 3 numbers, their cell phones and the pharmacy, and a parental control setting that made it impossible to dial any other number without a code he neglected to share. And he explained that robocallers target seniors and he was only protecting me. And I thought of protection as a blanket you tuck around a sleeping child, not a net you lower over an animal you intend to move to a smaller cage. They changed the Wi-Fi password and forgot to give me the new one. They shifted the coffee can to a cabinet beyond the reach of my chair and said, caffeine was not good for a man my age. They replaced my sturdy cane with a lighter one that bent when I leaned too hard and then clucked their tongues when I nearly toppled over. They began narrating my forgetfulness to the neighbors. Did you hear he left the oven on? As if gossip could prepare the ground for whatever paperwork they hoped to plant. And when Mrs. Calhoun from across the street asked me timidly one morning whether I had thought about assisted living, because her cousin's father loved his place and made friends at bingo. The air around me felt colder, though the sun was streaming through the lace curtains Martha had loved. Somewhere in that week of careful reductions, my daughter scheduled a routine checkup with a geriatrician she knew through a friend. And on the drive, my son-in-law rehearsed answers the way a coach preps a nervous athlete if the doctor asks about, the pills say you sometimes forget. If he asks about the stove, laugh and tell him you don't cook much anymore since Martha passed. If he asks about dates, smile and say you mix them up now and then. And I nodded because the car was moving and the seatbelt was tight, and there is a kind of survival that is sometimes wiser than open resistance. But I carried the words like receipts folded in a wallet, proof to myself of how far the conspiracy had already traveled. In the exam room, the doctor's smile was professional and his questions gentle. Draw a clock face, sir. Count backward from 100 by sevens. Remember 3 words. And I did what I could, with a hand that shook and a mind that contested the demand. To perform on cue, while my daughter watched with a polite concern so polished I could see my reflection in it. And when we were done, the doctor said he would like to see me again in a month, and that it might be helpful to discuss long-term planning, as cognition can fluctuate. And my daughter squeezed my shoulder in a gesture that would have been loving if her nails had not pressed a warning into my skin. That night I wheeled to the window after they left, and noticed that the porch light had been unscrewed to a dull glow, and the front step rug rolled away, so that the threshold lip stood an inch higher and unkind. Tiny edits of my environment that had one purpose, to make me stumble, and to make the stumble look inevitable. And as I sat there listening to the house breathe its old sighs, I understood that the binder had not been a proposal, but a testing of the fence around me, checking for weak posts and loose boards, and now that I had refused to walk through the gate, they would probably start pushing from the other side. In the days that followed, they brought a cheerful woman from Home Safety Consulting, who spoke to me in the tone reserved for toddlers and patted my hand before recommending that the stove knobs be removed and the bathroom door rehinged to open outward so caregivers could assist if I fell. And when I asked who those caregivers might be, she smiled as if at a private joke and said, "Family is the first line of care." And my daughter nodded solemnly like a judge issuing a sentence. Then confiscated the old letter box where Martha kept our important documents under a stack of recipes, humming as she labeled a new folder, Legacy. I told myself that vigilance would be my defense, that I would stack my days like sandbags against a rising river. But vigilance without allies is only a man on a watchtower with a broken horn, and the feeling of being alone grew so large that even the halls seemed to narrow. And yet somewhere inside, the ache and the anger, I felt the lever move. The silent click that separates passive endurance from the patient beginning of a plan. And though I did not yet know how or when the test would come, I knew that the next time they smiled and spoke of safety, I would smile too and say yes, where I needed to, and know where it mattered. Because a catalyst is not just an event that happens to you. It is the moment you decide that your name will not be signed by anyone else's hand. The humiliations did not arrive as a storm, but as a steady drizzle. And sometimes I wondered whether that was the cruelest part, because each drop seemed harmless until the ground beneath me had turned to mud. It began with the keys, those brass tokens of ownership I had carried since the day Martha and I signed the mortgage on this house. Keys that had dangled from my belt loop during factory shifts and jingled in my pocket whenever I walked home from the park. One afternoon, after my daughter had brought me groceries, I reached for them on the hook by the door and found the hook bare. She smiled in that condescending way, almost maternal, and said, "Don't worry, Daddy, I'm keeping them for you now, so you won't lose them." It sounded harmless, even logical, but the effect was sharp as a blade. The house was still mine, yet I could not open its doors without permission. Then came the phone, the old wall unit, beige and stubborn, that had rung with laughter and tears. The phone Martha had used to call her sisters every Sunday went dead without warning. When I asked, my son-in-law presented me with a gleaming little cell phone, a device programmed with only 3 numbers, their own and the pharmacy. "Simpler," he said, his voice coated with a mock kindness that reminded me of men in uniform who pretend to guide prisoners toward safety while leading them into a cage. I told him I still needed to call neighbors, the church, my old union brothers, but he only shook his head. "Less chance of scams this way," he replied, as if protecting me from the world required cutting all its strings. The third drop fell in the form of stories. Lies slipped into conversations with neighbors, told with a casual shrug. One afternoon, Mrs. Calhoun from across the street stopped me while I was wheeling down the driveway, and in her cautious voice she asked whether I was feeling better after that stove incident. I stared at her, puzzled. "What stove incident?" She looked embarrassed and said that my daughter had mentioned I had nearly burned the house down by forgetting to turn the burner off. I wanted to scream, but instead I told her calmly that nothing of the kind had happened. Still, I saw the doubt in her eyes, the way her smile faltered. A seed had been planted, and once a seed of suspicion is planted in the soil of gossip, it tends to grow fast. They chipped away at dignity in countless tiny ways. They would pour my coffee before I had a chance to reach the pot, reminding me not to spill. They replaced my cane with a lighter one that bent dangerously when I leaned on it, then chuckled when I stumbled, saying I should consider a walker. They bought groceries in smaller and smaller quantities, and when I asked why, my daughter said that old men don't eat much anyway, as if she were an expert on the habits of men who had lived longer than she had been alive. At family dinners, when the rare invitation came, I noticed how they would order for me without asking, choosing soft food as if I had no teeth left, speaking about me to the waiter instead of letting me speak for myself. Each gesture carried a mask of concern, but reeked of control. The final blow that sealed my awareness came one evening when they insisted I attend a dinner at their friend's house. I wheeled into the dining room, dressed in my best sweater, hoping to feel human again, only to hear my daughter laugh softly and say to the other couple, "You'll have to excuse Daddy, he forgets things sometimes. Just yesterday he tried to take his medicine twice in 1 hour." It was a lie, an invention designed to smear me in front of strangers. I sat there with a fork heavy in my hand, my cheeks burning, while the others nodded sympathetically as though I were a child pretending to be an adult. Later, when I confronted her in private, asking why she would humiliate me so openly, she shrugged and replied, "It's better if people know, Daddy. That way they understand if you get confused." It was in that moment, standing in the dim light of her kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence, that I understood the escalation was deliberate. This was no accident, no casual thoughtlessness. They were building a case, stone by stone, painting me as unreliable, forgetful, unsafe. They wanted the neighbors to believe it, the doctors to record it, the courts to accept it. They wanted me to doubt myself, to start wondering if maybe I really was slipping, if maybe my memories were fraying. But I knew better. My mind was still sharp enough to recognize the shape of a trap, even as it closed around me. The indignities collected inside me like steam in a sealed kettle. I pretended not to notice, because open defiance would only confirm their lies. But inside I seethed. I lay awake at night, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, remembering the men I had served with in Korea. Men who had survived foxholes and winter marches only to come home and be forgotten. I thought of Martha, who had trusted me to protect our family, and I wondered whether she would have recognized what her daughter had become. And most of all, I thought of the keys, the phone, the stories, each one a link in a chain they were tightening around me, preparing for the day when I would no longer be free, even in my own home. That was the first escalation. Not a shove into the abyss, not yet, but a steady push toward the edge, the kind that makes a man question his footing. They thought I would crumble quietly, that I would accept the role of helpless old man they scripted for me. But in the quiet of my room, with the moonlight painting silver stripes across the floor, I swore to myself that I would not let them write the end of my story. It was on a warm afternoon in early May that their intentions finally bared their teeth, the kind of afternoon that tricks you into thinking the world is still gentle, because the sun lies low and golden on the branches and the breeze carries the sweetness of freshly cut grass. My daughter had suggested we take a walk, saying the weather was too fine to waste indoors, and though I had grown wary of her sudden bursts of kindness, I agreed because even suspicion needs an outlet, and the thought of fresh air was tempting after so many weeks of walls and whispers. They wheeled me through the park, my son-in-law pushing with mechanical steadiness, while she walked beside us, talking in that falsely bright tone reserved for children and invalids. I tried to enjoy the sight of children playing soccer, the dogs chasing sticks, the couples holding hands, but I could feel something taut beneath the surface, like the vibration of a wire pulled too tight. We reached the edge of the park where the paved path bent toward the busy street, cars streaming past in their impatient rhythm, horns puncturing the air. My son-in-law slowed the chair, leaned down as if to adjust the footrest, and then, with a sudden thrust that jolted my spine, he pushed me forward, straight off the curb, into the roar of traffic. For a breathless second, I felt the world tilt, the wheelchair rolling freely on its casters, the cars looming larger with every heartbeat. Horns blared, tires screeched, and I thought, so this is it. This is how they will finish the job and call it an accident. But fate, or perhaps something sturdier than fate, intervened. A young man in a delivery uniform sprinted from the sidewalk, his arms pumping like pistons, and grabbed the handles of my chair just as the nose of a blue sedan skidded inches from my knees. The chair jerked backward onto the curb, and I sat shaking, my hands gripping the sides until my knuckles whitened. The young man was cursing under his breath, demanding to know what the hell was wrong with us. Didn't we see the cars? Was I trying to die? My daughter rushed forward with a performance of horror, pressing her hand to her mouth, exclaiming that it was a mistake. Thornton must have slipped. Daddy is safe. Thank God. Thank God. Thornton muttered something about uneven pavement, his face pale, but his eyes hard. And before I could speak, the young man was gone, still shaking his head, while they wheeled me quickly away from the intersection as though speed could erase what had just happened. I said nothing during the long roll back to the house, nothing when they lifted me clumsily over the porch step, nothing when my daughter made tea and insisted I drink it to calm my nerves. But inside, the silence was louder than any scream, and in that silence, I understood with perfect clarity that what I had only suspected before was now undeniable truth. They wanted me gone. Not just weakened, not merely humiliated, but gone. My refusal to sign the papers, my insistence on retaining control of what was mine, had hardened their greed into something darker. They had gambled that the world would believe an old man in a wheelchair had simply lost control and rolled into traffic. And they had nearly been right. That night I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment in my mind. The push, the rushing cars, the sudden rescue. I thought of Martha and wondered if she had whispered into that young man's ear, urging him to run at that precise instant. I thought of the years I had spent believing family was a sanctuary, and I realized that the sanctuary had become a battlefield. They had declared their war, not with words, but with action. And from that moment forward, I understood that passivity would be my undoing. I had survived war before. I had survived grief, and I would survive this. The difference now was that survival meant strategy. I would have to play their game of patience and deception, smiling when they demanded smiles, nodding when they demanded obedience, all the while preparing quietly, secretly, for the day when I would reclaim not only my dignity, but my freedom. The midpoint of my ordeal was not just that near death in the street, but the awakening it forced upon me. In that narrow space between life and death, when the screech of brakes still rang in my ears, I remembered something my old sergeant used to say. Once the enemy shows his hand, the battle has truly begun. And as I lay in the shadows of my quiet room, my pulse still trembling, I knew the battle had indeed begun, and that I would not be the one to lose it. After that day in the park, after the sudden lurch into the street and the screech of tires that still echoes in my ears, I began to see every gesture of theirs in a new light, and the terrible clarity of suspicion became the lens through which I measured their words, their touches, their glances. Nothing they did seemed innocent any longer. Not the way my daughter smoothed the lapel of my jacket before we left the house. Not the way my son-in-law lingered behind my chair as if calculating angles. Not even the way they placed a hand on my shoulder, which once might have been affection, but now felt like a prelude to a shove. I stopped telling myself that perhaps I was overreacting, that perhaps age had made me paranoid, because I had lived too long and seen too much to mistake malice for clumsiness. And in the private corners of my mind, I admitted the truth. They were tightening the trap, and the next escalation would be sharper than the last. It came first, in the form of papers. My daughter appeared one morning with a heavy manila envelope, smiling with the brightness of someone who has already rehearsed her lines. She said it was nothing important, just insurance updates, standard forms, legal housekeeping, and she set them down in front of me with a pen. I looked at the pages and saw the dense language of transfer and consent, the same language I had once signed without hesitation when I was younger, and trusted the people who slid such papers across the table. Now I read slowly, my eyes catching on phrases like assignment of interest, irrevocable designation, power of attorney. My daughter's smile tightened as the minutes dragged. "Daddy, don't strain yourself," she said. "You know you can trust me." But I did not sign, not that day and not the next. And when I told her I would have my lawyer look them over, her face flickered with something raw. Something hateful she quickly masked behind a sigh. She gathered the papers back into the envelope, muttering about wasted time. And that night I heard her whispering to her husband in the kitchen, their voices sharp, words like stubborn and dangerous slipping through the door. Then came the doctor. They took me to an appointment I had not scheduled, a specialist I had never heard of, a man who greeted me with the warm detachment of someone already convinced of his conclusions. He asked me to draw a clock, to count backward by sevens, to remember 3 words he recited in a flat tone. I complied. though my hand shook from the strain of holding the pencil. And when I finished, he nodded vaguely while my daughter leaned forward in her chair, eager as a prosecutor awaiting a verdict. "Some lapses are normal," the doctor said, "but there are concerns." I wanted to protest, to demand a second opinion, but the words jammed in my throat. I realized with a chill that they wanted this diagnosis, that they needed a professional signature to certify the story they had already been weaving to neighbors and friends. I left the office with a pamphlet on dementia clutched in my lap, and my daughter's hand squeezing mine in a mockery of comfort, her voice chirping, "See, Daddy, we'll take good care of you," as though the verdict were already sealed. Humiliation followed. Humiliation, each designed to make me smaller. At a family gathering, they invited me to, if it can be called an invitation when refusal is not tolerated, they corrected me in front of others, insisting I had mixed up dates, that I had misremembered events, that I was confusing names. When I told a story from the factory floor, one I had told 100 times before, my son-in-law chuckled and said, "He gets the details wrong now, but we don't mind, it's cute." Cute, as though decades of labor and sweat and sacrifice were reduced. To the babbling of a senile clown, my cheeks burned, but I bit my tongue, knowing that anger would only fuel their narrative. Later, when the guests had left, I heard my daughter sigh to her husband, "Everyone can see it now. It's only a matter of time." But the cruelest discovery came not from their words, but from the documents I stumbled upon. One quiet afternoon, when they had left me alone in the living room under the pretense of shopping, I maneuvered my chair toward the side table where my daughter had carelessly left her binder. I opened it with trembling fingers and found, sandwiched between bank statements and neatly tabbed sections, a draft petition for guardianship. My name was there, in bold, beneath the words, "Proposed ward." Their names followed as petitioners, and the language was clinical, devastating, incapable of managing finances, vulnerable to undue influence, requires full supervision. Attached was a photocopy of a letter I had never seen, supposedly from my physician, suggesting cognitive decline. My hands shook so violently I nearly tore the page. They were preparing to strip me not only of property, but of personhood itself, to reduce me legally to a child, to take the last remnant of independence I possessed. I sat there staring at the words until my vision blurred, and for the first time in many years I felt tears gather. Not the clean tears of grief, but the hot, choking tears of betrayal. My daughter, the child I had held against my chest the night she was born, the child whose scraped knees I had kissed, whose school projects I had proudly displayed, had signed her name to a document declaring me unfit to live as a man. It was more than greed. It was annihilation. They wanted to erase me while I still breathed. That night I resolved to act, not with fury, but with cunning. Because a man in my position could not afford open rebellion, I called an old neighbor, one of the last friends who still remembered the man I used to be, and asked for the number of a lawyer who had once helped him settle a dispute. Quietly, secretly, I arranged a meeting. The lawyer, a patient man with eyes like flint, listened without interruption as I described the lies, the humiliations, the near accident in the park, and finally showed him the draft petition I had stolen from the binder. He nodded slowly, saying, "They are building a case, but you can build one too." He explained that I could document everything, that I could secure evaluations from independent doctors, that I could take steps to protect my accounts before they gained access. He gave me a list, and I tucked it into my coat pocket like a map for escape. Meanwhile, the assaults continued, subtle and sharp. My daughter began insisting I no longer needed cash, that she would handle all withdrawals for me. And one day when I checked my wallet, I discovered the bills I had set aside for groceries were gone. My son-in-law claimed to have borrowed them for gas and forgot to tell me. They installed new locks on the windows, saying it was for safety, though I noticed that the keys fit only their ring, not mine. They began talking more openly about assisted living, dropping brochures on the coffee table, glossy pages showing smiling seniors playing bingo, as if confinement could be softened with stock photos. They spoke to me less as a father and more as a project, a responsibility, a problem to be solved. And yet I endured, recording each indignity in the notebook I kept hidden under the cushion of my chair, each insult and manipulation written in my shaky hand, a chronicle of betrayal that no court could ignore. I gathered the courage to visit a different doctor, one chosen not by them, but by myself, and I submitted to every test he asked, every memory exercise, every neurological scan. When the results came back, clear and firm, stating that I was of sound mind and capable of independent decision-making, I felt a flicker of triumph. I made copies of the report and gave them to my lawyer, who smiled grimly and said, "This will be useful." The second escalation was not a single event, but a campaign. A war fought in whispers and papers, in stolen keys and altered pillboxes, in staged forgetfulness and fabricated stories. They thought they were wearing me down, but in truth they were sharpening me, stripping away my illusions, forcing me into the clarity of the battle. And as I sat by the window one evening, the sun sinking behind the houses, the notebook heavy on my lap, I realized that their cruelty had given me a gift they did not intend, the gift of resolve. They believed they were tightening the noose, but I was already loosening its knot, preparing for the moment when the rope would slip from my neck and coil instead around theirs. The turning point arrived not in some storm of rage or midnight confrontation, but in the quiet precision of preparation meeting opportunity. For battles are often won not by the loudest blow, but by the hand that has steadied itself long enough to strike true. I had spent weeks gathering my evidence, copying medical reports, keeping my notebook updated, and conferring with my lawyer in hushed tones that felt almost conspiratorial. Every time my daughter smiled too brightly or my son-in-law pressed too heavily on the handles of my chair, I reminded myself that their game was nearly finished, that they thought themselves clever architects of my downfall even as the ground shifted beneath them. The moment came on a Wednesday afternoon when they arrived with another stack of papers, their faces carefully arranged in masks of benevolent authority. "Daddy, this is just a formality," my daughter said, placing the documents on the table as though she were laying down a meal prepared with love. My son-in-law stood behind her, silent but radiating expectation, his arms crossed in the smug posture of a man who believes victory is inevitable. They told me it was a final step in securing my safety, that the doctor's concerns required them to take measures, that once I signed, everything would be simpler, smoother, no more confusion or risk. I looked at the pages and saw the familiar words, transfer, consent, guardianship, and then I looked at them. These two people who shared my blood and my roof, yet not my heart, and I felt something inside me harden into steel. I asked them to sit, told them I would sign nothing until certain matters were clarified, and when they exchanged a glance of irritation, I wheeled myself to the cabinet where I had hidden the folder prepared with my lawyer. My hand shook, but not with weakness. It was the trembling of anticipation, the weight of justice about to be set free. I laid the folder on the table, opened it, and slid across the copies of the independent medical evaluations, each page stamped and signed by specialists attesting to my competence, my clarity, my unbroken mind. Their faces faltered, the first cracks in their performance. But before they could recover, I produced the notebook, pages filled with my careful script, each entry dated, each incident of manipulation and deceit recorded in detail. "I may be old," I said quietly, But I am not helpless, and I am not mad. You have tried to make me both, and now it is you who must answer for it." They tried to laugh, to dismiss it as paranoia, but I cut them off by placing the final piece on the table. The notarized amendment to my will, and the property documents my. Lawyer had drawn up. I told them plainly that the house would not pass to them, that my savings were now shielded beyond their reach, and that the only inheritance they would receive was a single symbolic dollar. The rest would go to causes and people who understood the meaning of sacrifice and loyalty, veterans' organizations, charities that fed the hungry, institutions that Martha would have been proud to support. My daughter's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water, and my son-in-law's face flushed the deep, ugly red of a man denied spoils he had already counted. The air in the room thickened with their fury. My daughter's voice rose, shrill and shaking, accusing me of betrayal, of cruelty, of abandoning her when she had only ever tried to help. My son-in-law slammed his hand on the table, demanding to know how I dared undo their work, insisting that the law was on their side. That was when I delivered the blow that ended the charade. I told them about the lawyer I had hired, the petition I had already filed to challenge their guardianship attempt, the bank accounts secured, the credit cards canceled, the neighbors who had agreed to testify about their lies. I told them I had already beaten them to the finish line, that the court would see them not as dutiful caretakers, but as predators exposed. For a long moment the room was silent except for the sound of my breathing, heavy but steady. And then my daughter collapsed into the chair opposite me, her face crumpling as though she had been struck. My son-in-law remained standing, glaring at me with hatred so thick it was almost tangible. But even he understood the finality of what had just unfolded. They had lost. They could scream, they could threaten, they could curse my name, but the foundation of their scheme had crumbled, and all their rehearsed narratives now looked like what they were, a performance exposed. In that silence, I felt no triumph, only the profound weight of release, as though I had been carrying a stone for years and had finally set it down. The climax was not in shouting or revenge, but in the simple act of reclaiming what was mine, of asserting before the people who had tried to erase me that I was still here, still thinking, still able to shape the course of my own life. They left soon after, slamming the door behind them, and though the house trembled with the violence of their exit, I remained still, listening to the quiet that followed. For the first time in years, that quiet was not suffocating. It was peace. After they left that afternoon, their anger trailing behind them like the exhaust of a car speeding away, the house fell into a stillness that felt at once foreign and familiar. Foreign, because for so long the air here had been filled with the rustle of their plans and the hiss of their manipulations. Familiar because it was the kind of quiet Martha and I once cherished, the hush of a home that belonged entirely to us. I sat at the table with the papers spread before me, the ink of my lawyer's signature still fresh, and I felt the weight of years settle differently upon my shoulders, not as a burden pressing me down, but as a cloak I had earned, heavy yet dignified. For the first time since my stroke, I did not feel like a man diminished, but like a man who had endured and prevailed. In the days that followed, they did not return. There were no phone calls, no sudden visits, no staged deliveries of groceries or forced reminders about pills. The silence stretched, and though part of me mourned the final rupture of the bond I had once believed unbreakable, a deeper part of me felt a release so profound it was almost joy. I had loved my daughter with the unquestioning devotion only a parent can give, but love cannot survive when it is fed only with betrayal. And I understood at last that clinging to the illusion of family had nearly cost me my life, my home, and my very name. By cutting her away, I was not mutilating myself, but saving what remained. The lawyer visited again, bringing news that the petition for guardianship had been quietly withdrawn, perhaps out of shame, perhaps out of fear of exposure. He said I had nothing to worry about now, that the law was firmly on my side, that the documents we had secured made my wishes ironclad. I nodded and thanked him, but inside I thought less of laws and more of justice, that strange and elusive thing which sometimes comes not from judges or statutes, but from the simple act of refusing to bow. I realized then that justice, for me, was not watching them punished or dragged through courts, but simply living the remainder of my days without their shadow looming over me. I began to make changes, small at first, then larger. I arranged for a volunteer from the veterans group to stop by twice a week, not as a keeper, but as a companion, someone who could share stories and help with tasks that required two hands. I contacted the local senior center and discovered that even in a chair, I could participate in gatherings, book discussions, even music nights where old songs were sung with trembling voices that still carried strength. I allowed myself, for the first time since Martha's passing, to belong again, not as a relic tolerated, but as a man among men and women who knew the weight of years. The house itself I no longer regarded as a trap, but as a shrine. I moved Martha's books back into their rightful shelves, dusted the photographs that had sat neglected, and opened the curtains wide to let the sun in. I even found the courage to sit at the piano she once played, running my hands over the keys, though my fingers could no longer coax music. In those moments I felt her presence, not as a ghost haunting, but as a warmth sustaining, as if she approved of what I had done, as if she whispered that the hardest battles are not fought with rifles, but with resolve. Neighbors who had believed the rumors began to look at me differently once they saw I was not fading, but steady, present, and sharp. Mrs. Calhoun brought me a pie one afternoon, her eyes full of apology she did not put into words, and I accepted it with a smile that told her I bore no grudge. People are quick to believe lies, but they are also quick to correct themselves when truth proves stronger. And in that slow shift of perception, I found another form of victory. I was no longer the confused old man tottering on the edge of oblivion. I was Ernest Halbrook, veteran, husband, father betrayed, but not destroyed, still capable of shaping the story of his own end. The final act of closure came when I signed the revised will, not in secret, but with witnesses present, friends from the veterans' home who stood beside me as guarantors. I left my daughter and her husband exactly $1, a sum so paltry it would sting more than silence, and I left the rest to the causes Martha and I had spoken of in the quiet nights when our dreams still stretched ahead of us. It was not revenge, but restoration, an act that placed meaning where they had tried to sow greed. As I signed, I felt the circle close, not with bitterness, but with clarity. They had pushed me toward traffic, but I had rolled not into death, but into a future of my own making. Now, when the evenings come and the sun sinks low, I wheel myself to the porch and watch the street where children play and neighbors stroll. And I breathe deeply of the air that still belongs to me. I am old, yes, and my body is failing, but my spirit is unbroken, and I carry with me the knowledge that I did not allow betrayal to define the end of my life. The war my family waged against me has ended, and though I carry scars, I also carry victory, quiet but undeniable. In that victory I have found peace, and in that peace I have found Martha again, not as a shadow, but as a memory that sustains me. And so I wait for the end, not in fear, but in dignity, knowing that when it comes, it will meet a man who refused to surrender, a man who rolled right over their plans and claimed his own.